topics to be covered for this chapter are history of geometry, book elements by Euclid, terms such as definitions, axioms, postulates and theorems, the fifth postulate, and finally non-Euclidean geometry, after which we will take a look at the summary to check the overview of the entire chapter. So first of all, who is Euclid? Euclid is a very famous mathematician. He is also known as the father of geometry. So let us start with the introduction. What is geometry? We will derive it from the word itself. We have why have I inserted a hyphen between geo and metry? Geo stands for earth and metry stands for measurement. So geometry is nothing but measurement of land. Okay, so there was a need to measure land, which gave rise to geometry. So now this doesn't just fit into the criteria why geometry was needed. So I'll give you an example. Most of you must have heard about River Nile. River Nile is in Egypt. So what used to happen is, this is suppose River Nile, okay, and at the sides of it there were farmers who were inhabitants in the vicinity of River Nile. So these were the boundaries that were set up. Suppose farmer 1 stayed here, 2 or any resident 3, 4, 5. So these were blocks. Similarly, there were blocks here. And these blocks kept on extending in the vicinity. There were many such blocks and boundaries that separated them. Okay, and so on. So this is my River Nile. Now when it was steady, that is in the normal flow, everything was steady in the adjoint areas as well. But whenever due to tides or flooding, the River Nile used to overflow, these boundaries used to get wiped out. All these boundaries used to get wiped out. So apart from the damages that the farmers or the residents, the inhabitants of the adjoint areas of River Nile suffered, so they even suffered loss of their property in most of the situations. Why? Because these boundaries were wiped out. So they did not know how much area they have missed out. And so if, let's say, farmer 1 started with reconstruction or renovation, he might just take a little more area of 2. If 2 start, or after 1, let's say 3 started, they must have occupied a little more area of 4. So you can see that farmer 2 and farmer 4 suffered. Now why did farmer 2 and farmer 4 suffer? Because farmer 1 and farmer 3, they took more property because they had the leeway of starting their renovation earlier. So there was a need for geometry, that is measuring land, so that these farmers, all these farmers, unfortunate farmers like 3 and 4 and many others in the vicinity, they had to so that they could measure their land before these floods arose and keep a record of it somewhere, so that later on whenever such unfortunate incident takes place, they could just go back, renovate, and there would be no loss of property. So this was a very important and major reason why there was a need for geometry. So now we spoke about Egypt. Let's come back to India. I'm sure you must have heard about Harappa civilization and Indus Valley civilization. Now these were the most civilized and planned civilizations. Now why would I say planned? Planned because if you take a look at the photos of these civilizations, their standard of living and the houses that they built, they were all parallel, very well built. There were proper valleys. So there was a valley that was parallel and there was another section or block. So everything was very planned, although there weren't any documents that were formalized for these constructions. So you can see that even in India, civilizations like Harappa and Indus Valley civilization are good examples which demonstrate that geometry had already existed but nothing was formalized. So everything here was unsystematic, because no content about these measurements were formalized. And let's say if I was a person at that time who had all the content and knowledge about geometry, I would not really write it on a paper and pass it to everyone, but I would pass it on to my generation by word of mouth. So only generations, so knowledge was very limited and it was transferred only by word of mouth. So not everyone knew, it was more like a secret. So places that demonstrated or displayed the existence of geometry. So in earlier days, there were 4 places that displayed the existence of geometry. They were Iraq, India, Egypt, and Greece. So what was common between the first 3 and uncommon among these 3 and Greece? Geometry did exist and demonstrated very well in all these 3 places, but nothing was formalized and everything was unsystematic. So, but Greece, the mathematicians of Greece, they came up with concepts to define geometry, to formalize the content, everything, so which helped in deductive sciences. So they were the ones who started to reason, who created definitions, who proved various rules, and finally the ones who documented. So what was the difference between Iraq, India, Egypt and Greece? So these 3 together and Greece. The Greek mathematicians, they believed in documenting all data, compiling all the notes, so that information related to geometry could be spread worldwide, and many new tools and equipments or other proofs could be deduced, so that geometry would actually exist as not an abstract but as a theory. So Greece and systematic geometry. Why systematic geometry? Because everything was systematic and not unsystematic. I'll tell you why. For example, the earlier mathematicians before the Greek mathematicians, they believed that a circle, if we have a circle and this is the diameter AB divides the circle into 2 halves. So this is natural to understand, right? But the Greek mathematicians, what they did is they actually proved that diameter is the bisector. Bisector means 2 sections, and a sector means sections. So which means the diameter divides the circle into 2 equal halves. So you see, everything was formalized. So who were some of the famous Greek mathematicians that we had? We had Pythagoras, Democritus, Aristotle, Euclid and Archimedes. Archimedes came after Euclid. But why? So what was their funda? To establish relationships between observations and reasons. For example, if there was a certain observation, for example over here, that the diameter is dividing the circle into 2 equal halves. So this was an observation, right? Bisector is dividing circle into 2 equal halves. Why was this an observation? Because when you look at it itself, you can see that the circle is getting divided into 2 equal halves. So what were the reasons? The reason is because the diameter is the bisector of the circle. So this is just an example. So obviously you can say which civilization gave birth to deductive geometry? It was the Greek civilization. So my question is, why are we studying geometry only specific to Euclid? We are studying geometry specific to Euclid because first of all he is known as the father of geometry. Now if somebody is called the father of geometry, it is not just for a small reason. Just like Gandhi ji is called the father of a nation, it's because he has really thrived for India's freedom. Similarly, Euclid's contribution has been immense in geometry and you know, every term that is being defined in geometry today. So Euclid is father of geometry. And what was his contribution? He collected data related to geometry from different resources and he compiled them all together into a book known as 13 Elements. Now the book 13 Elements has 13 chapters and each chapter is called books. So the first chapter is called book 1, second chapter is called book 2, third chapter is called book 3, so until book 13. So there were 13 such chapters which had not only definitions and theorems related to geometry, but also it related algebra to geometry. And it's a very influential book. According to the analysis that was conducted, the book 13 Elements, it is the second most influential book. So why second most influential? Because many mathematicians have referred to this book for their future studies. So just in case in future you plan to take a PhD in mathematics or you plan to do some study related to mathematics, this is one book that you really cannot miss. That is 13 Elements. So what is Euclid geometry? Let us define Euclid geometry. Now from the starting of our book itself, we are learning about different systems. So Euclid's geometry is nothing but a mathematical system that performs the study of planes and solid figures. So it's a mathematical system which is performing a study of planes and solid figures. So what are planes? The best example of a plane is a paper. You have the x and y axis, and solid figures can be cubes, cuboids, cones. They are three-dimensional. Why three-dimensional? Because they have three axes, x, y and z. You will learn about all these axes as and when you proceed with other chapters in mathematics and in your future classes. But so mathematical system that performs the studies of planes and solid figures is Euclid's geometry. So book Elements by Euclid, we already took a look at the book Elements of Euclid, which are 13 chapters. Each chapter is known as book. So and each chapter is represented as book 1, book 2, book 3 and so on until book 13. It consists of geometry and concepts that connect geometry to algebra as well. So this was about the introduction. We have covered the following topics: history of geometry and book Elements by Euclid. We'll take a look at the remaining topics in the next class. Thank you.
Hope this video increased your knowledge. For more such videos and a completely free educational content, log on to www.epathshala.org or visit our ePathshala YouTube channel. We have each and every question solved for maths, physics, chemistry and biology. So subscribe our channel, share with your friends, like our Facebook page and follow our Twitter handle for regular updates and important educational tips, and also win ePathshala goodies. So what are you waiting for? Subscribe this channel and enjoy the freedom of education.